Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Low Content Publishing for Beginners video series. My name's Rachel Harrison-Sund. Are you a creative at heart that falls just a little bit short when it comes to the technical aspects of printing low content books? If so, today's video is for you. So I'm just going to be talking a little bit about the various printing terms that you should probably be familiar with before you start printing low content books. First, we're going to be talking about some common printing terms that you need to know, and then we're going to be talking a little bit about images and the different file types and image resolution and all that kind of stuff that is really important for you to know before you try and send anything to print. We want to cut down on the amount of mistakes that you make while you're creating your low content books, so then when it comes time to hit that publish button, you're not, being sent back to the drawing board over and over again, trying to fix things that you really didn't know would be an issue in the first place. So first, let's talk about a few printing terms. The first one I'm going to talk about is bleed. The bleed is essentially the edge around your document that's just going to get trimmed off in the printing process. So the reason a bleed is necessary is if you've got images that extend to the edge of the page, when that page gets trimmed, you don't want any awkward areas left off that are going to be unprinted, essentially. You need to extend that image over the edge of the page so then when it trims, you're not going to get any of those awkward unprinted areas. So when you're producing your cover for your low content book, that book cover always requires a bleed around the edge of it. And that's because most likely your book cover is not going to be white. So there's always going to be some sort of a colored background that your book cover, that you include in your book cover. So you're always going to require a bleed for your book cover. Now, you also need a bleed for your interior if you have text or images that run straight to the edge of the page. When you're creating your document, you're going to want to add an extra 1/4 of an inch to the height and also to the width of your document. If you're creating an interior manuscript that does not have any imagery going to the edge of the page, then you don't need to worry about bleed at all. So the next term is trim size, and that is pretty explanatory. That's just going to be the final size of your piece after the bleed has been trimmed off. The next term is margins, and pretty much all of you are already going to be familiar with margins because we've all typed things up in a Word document before, but the margin is just that blank space around the entire perimeter of your page where the text does not enter into. The wider your margins are, the more airy your design is going to feel. So, you can experiment with margins a little bit, but just don't overdo it. We don't need too much white space. The main thing you want to take note of is to just ensure that you give yourself enough of a margin and that it's not too small. So KDP has a handy little web page with all of their guidelines for margin sizes. So if you haven't checked that out, be sure you do, just so that you know exactly how wide to make your margins, at the very minimum at least. So moving on, we've got gutter, and gutter is essentially the inside margin. Now, normally your inside margin would be a little bit smaller than the outside margin if you're looking to create a book with nice proportions, visually speaking. But because we are creating perfect bound books, that is what KDP's service has us creating. They're perfect bound books. Because of that specific binding process, you're going to end up losing inside margin space to the spine of the book. So in this case, your inside margin actually needs to be wider than the outside margin. And again, KDP has very specific guidelines for what the minimum requirements are for the inside margin or gutter. So make sure you take a look at that so that you've got enough room going down that center of the strip. So next, we're going to talk about color models. So there are two basic color models. One of them is additive color and the other one is subtractive color. And I won't go into tons and tons of detail here because it just really isn't relevant. But I'll just give you the basic Coles Notes version. So an additive color model is basically one that uses light to display colors. And the best example of that is a TV or your computer monitor. Subtractive color models are those that are used primarily in printing, and what they do is subtract brightness from a white background by applying color over top of it. So the reason it's important to know those two different types of color models is because when you're downloading imagery, you're going to be faced with images that are either in the CMYK format, which is the subtractive color model, and also the RGB format, which is the additive color model. Now, for printing, we want to be using CMYK images. And the reason is that those colors are specifically for printing. Because the RGB color model is used primarily for displays, when you print them out, you don't always get the result that you wanted and, the result that you saw on the screen in front of you before printing it out. So there might actually be quite a bit of a discrepancy between what you see on your screen and what actually comes out on the other end of the printing press. So you can actually submit artwork to KDP with images that are in RGB mode. They will do the conversion for you on the other side, but it's just something to note that if you're going for a very, very specific color, you're probably not going to get the exact color that you thought you were going to get. Now, CMYK is pretty good at color matching, but it is a little bit of a gamble, so it just depends on how finicky you are with that. Okay, so now let's talk about image resolution. So resolution is basically a way of describing the level of detail within a particular image, and it's usually talked about in terms of either DPI, which is dots per inch, and PPI, which is pixels per inch. So when we're talking about pixels per inch, we are basically talking about images that we're going to be viewing on a screen. So we don't necessarily need to worry too much about PPI. What we need to be concerned with is DPI, the dots per inch, because that is used for determining print resolution. So this is an extremely important thing to consider when you're using imagery in your books. You always want to make sure that your imagery is at least 300 DPI. Otherwise, you're going to lose image quality and you might actually end up with a blurry image on the other side of things. Now, KDP is pretty good at catching low resolution images when you're uploading your cover to KDP. But the point is, if you catch it earlier on, before you're actually at the publishing stage, then you're not at the point where you've got your entire book complete, you're right at the publishing stage, you're uploading everything, and then Amazon tells you, wait a minute, your image is too low of a resolution and you're going to have to fix it. Because then you're kind of back to the drawing board. There's not really any clean way to increase an image's resolution. So, in that case, you might actually have to go back and either try and find a source image with a higher resolution, or if you can't, if it's just something you've downloaded from the internet that has been web optimized at 72 PPI, which is way lower than what we want, you might actually have to scrap that image and start all over again, and you really don't want to do that. The other thing to watch for is, even if you download an image and it is 300 DPI, if you scale that image up, you're going to end up losing resolution. So let's say you download an image and you check it out, it's 300 DPI, great, but that image, when you drop it into your file, is only 1 or 2 inches in height and width, and you wanted to use it to fully expand and take up the full width and height of your cover. The bigger you make that image, the more resolution it's going to lose. So even though you started with a 300 DPI image, if you scale that puppy all the way up to the entire size of your front cover, you might lose a couple hundred DPI there, and then at the end you're left with something that's maybe under 100 DPI. So that's not going to work. You always want to make sure that the image is 300 DPI at the size that you want it. Now, most programs will have some sort of feature where you can click on that image and there'll be an information pop-up where you can see what that image resolution is, so definitely make sure you're using that feature no matter what program you're in. Having said all that, you don't need to worry about image resolution at all if you're using vector graphics, because image resolution only applies to raster images. So we're going to get to that right now. So raster images are made up of pixels, and they can only be scaled up to a certain size before they start losing their resolution, which is what we were just talking about. You'll know it's a raster image if it's a photograph and or it's got a file extension of .jpeg, .png, .tiff, or .bmp, which is bitmap. So as I already mentioned, if you're using photographs in your cover art or anywhere within the interior manuscript of your book, then make sure you always check the resolution first to make sure that it's at least 300 dpi at whatever size you decide to make it. Okay, so we've got two types of images. We've already talked about raster images. So the next one are vector graphics. And vector graphics are different from raster images in that instead of being made up of pixels, they are made up of thousands and thousands of tiny lines that are put together through mathematical equations. And they are created via some sort of vector graphic creating program, such as Adobe Illustrator or something like that. And the great thing about vector graphics is that they are fully scalable. You never have to worry about resolution because they're not made up of pixels. So if you want to use vector graphics in your artwork, resolution is something you're never ever going to have to worry about. You can download a vector graphic that is 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and you can scale that sucker up as big as you want. I mean, you can put it on the side of a building if you want. So they're really easy to work with in that sense. You'll know that you're dealing with a vector graphic if you're dealing with some sort of illustration or some sort of shape or other type of graphic. And it will have a file extension of usually .eps or .svg, or if you're dealing with a source file, something like .ai. But most likely, if you're downloading a vector graphic, it'll come in .eps format. So just a final note about images here, and this may sound kind of silly, but I'm bringing it up because I've seen it probably dozens of times throughout my career as a graphic designer and an art director. If you start off with a JPEG image and you want to scale that up, but it's at too low of a resolution, you cannot just plop that JPEG into a vector editing program and save it as a .eps or a .svg file and expect that to now become a vector graphic. It is still a raster image, it's just been saved with another file extension. So you're still going to end up with a non-scalable image. So I just wanted to point that out just because I've seen it done. But I know none of you guys are going to do that. Okay, so there you have it. You are now no longer print production challenged. You know all the ins and outs of printing terms and image terms and types of images, and now you are set to go and build those books with confidence. If you want, go over to my blog and check out this post. I've got this all down in written format for easy reference. I've also got some images in there, so all the things I was talking about at the beginning, I've actually got as diagrams and images within the post. Just, if you're like me and you like to have some visual aids to go along with things you're listening to, then head on over there and you can check out all of the accompanying images that I've included. So thanks again, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already for more low content publishing tips. And as always, head on over to my blog for even more tips. And of course, if you haven't downloaded the 3 steps to publishing your first low content book in less than a day, then grab that in the description below. All right, thanks guys. Have a great one.